Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another night of Good Night Stories with Monica and, of course, George from the North Richland Hills Library. We've just started chapter 12, Alice's Evidence, when Alice has just tipped over the jury box and all the jurors fell out, and she's put them all back quite hastily. Let's see what happens next. "The trial cannot proceed," said the king in a very grave voice, "until all the jurymen are back in their proper places. All," he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he said so. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that, in her haste, she had put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail about in a melancholy way, being quite unable to move. She soon got it out again and put it right. "Not that it signifies much," she said to herself. "I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial one way up as the other." As soon as the jury had a little recovered from the shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils had all been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the accident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with its mouth gaping open and looking at the roof of the court. "What do you know about this business?" the king said to Alice. "Nothing," said Alice. "Nothing whatsoever?" said the king. "Nothing whatsoever," said Alice. "Well, that's very important," the king said, turning to the jury. And they were just beginning to write this down on their slates when the White Rabbit interrupted. "Unimportant, your majesty means, of course," he said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces at him. "Unimportant, of course I meant," the king said hastily, and went on to himself in an undertone, "Important, unimportant, unimportant, important," as if he were trying which word sounded best. Some of the jury wrote down important, and some wrote unimportant. Alice could see this, as she was near enough to look over their slates. But it doesn't matter a bit, she thought. At this moment the king, who had been some busily writing in his notebook, called out, "Silence!" and read out from his book, "Rule 42, all persons more than a mile high to leave the court." Everyone looked at Alice. "I am not a mile high," said Alice. "You are," said the king. "Nearly 2 miles high," added the queen. "Well, I shan't go at any rate," said Alice. "Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now." "It's the oldest rule in the book," said the king. "Well, then it ought to be number 1, said Alice. The king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily. "Consider your verdict," he said to the jury. "There's more evidence to come yet, please your majesty," said the White Rabbit, jumping up in a great hurry. "This paper has just been picked up." "What's in it?" said the queen. "I haven't opened it yet," said the White Rabbit, "but it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner to somebody." "It must have been that," said the king, "unless it was written to nobody, which it isn't, you know." "Who is it directed to?" said one of the jurymen. "It isn't directed at all," said the White Rabbit. "In fact, there's nothing written on the outside." He unfolded the paper as he spoke and added, "Oh, it isn't a letter after all. It's a set of verses." "Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?" "No, they're not," said the White Rabbit, "and that's the weirdest thing about it." The jury all looked puzzled. "He must have imitated somebody else's hand," said the king. The jury brightened up again. "Please, your majesty," said the knave, "I didn't write it, and they can't prove I did. There's no name signed at the end." "Well, if you didn't sign it," said the king, "that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd have signed your name like an honest man." There was a general clapping of hands at this, and it was the first really clever thing the king had said the whole day. "That proves his guilt," said the queen. "It proves nothing of the sort," said Alice. "Why, you don't even know what they're about." "Read them," said the king. The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. "Where shall I begin, please your majesty?" "Begin at the beginning," he said, "and go on till you come to the end, and then stop," said the king. So the White Rabbit read the verses out loud to the court, beginning at the beginning and ending at the end. Afterward, the king said, "That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet. So now let the jury, if any one of them can explain it," said Alice. She had grown so large in the last few minutes, she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting him. "I'll give him 6 pence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it." The jury all wrote down on their slates, "She doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it," but none of them attempted to explain it. "If there's no meaning in it," said the king, "that saves a world of trouble, you know, as we needn't try to find any. And yet, I don't know," he said, spreading out the verses on his knee, "I seem to see some meaning in them after all. Said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you?" he added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. "Do I look like it?" Which he certainly did not, being made entirely of cardboard. "All right so far," said the king, and he said another verse out loud. "We know it to be true," that's the jury, of course, "I gave her 1, then gave her 2. Why, that must be what he did with the tarts, you know. But it goes on, they all returned from him to you," said Alice. "Why, there they are," said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table. "Nothing can be clearer than that. Then again, before she had this fit—" "You never had fits, my dear, I think," he said to the queen. "Never," said the queen, throwing an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little lizard Bill had left off writing on his slate with one finger, as he found it made no mark, but now he began hastily again, using the ink that was trickling down his face as long as it lasted. "Then the words don't fit you," said the king, looking round the court with a smile. "It's a pun," said the king. "Let the jury consider their verdict," the king said for about the 20th time that day. "No, no," said the queen. "Sentence first, verdict after." "Stuff and nonsense," said Alice loudly. "The idea of having the sentence first." "Hold your tongue," said the queen, turning purple. "Well, I won't," said Alice. "Well, then off with her head," said the queen. "Who cares for you?" said Alice. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." At this time, the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her, and she gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off. And when she did, she found herself lying on the bank of the river, with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the tree onto her face. "Wake up, Alice dear," said her sister. "Why, you've had a long sleep." "Oh, I've had the most curious dream," said Alice, and she told her sister all about it, the strange adventures that you have just been reading about. When she had finished, her sister kissed her on the cheek and said, "It was a curious dream, dear, certainly, but now run in to get your tea, and it's getting late." So Alice got up and ran off to get her tea, thinking what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister sat still just as she left her, leaning a head on her hand, watching the setting sun, and thinking of Alice and all her wonderful adventures. And this she too began to dream. First she dreamed of little Alice herself. Once again the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, and she could hear the very tones of her voice and see that silly little toss of her head to keep back the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes, and still listen, or seem to listen, the whole place, because she came alive with the strange creatures of her sister's little dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by, and the frightened mouse splashed its way through the neighboring pool, and she could hear the rattle of the teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the queen ordering off unfortunate guests to have their heads cut off. Once more the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee, while plates and dishes crashed about. The squeaking of the lizard's slate pencil and the choking of the suppressed guinea pig. So she sat on, with closed eyes, and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew she had but to open her eyes again, and all would change back to the dull reality. The grass would only be rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the wave of the reeds, The rattling teacups would change to the tinkling sheep bells, and the queen's shrill cries to the voice of the shepherd boy, and the sneeze of the baby, the shriek of the griffin, and the other silly noises would change to the confused clamor of all the barnyard animals. Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through all her riper years, the simple and loving heart of the childhood, and how she would gather about her children and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dreams of Wonderland long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows and find a pleasure in their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days. The end. Well, George and everyone, that is the end of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Join us again and we will start a new story. Good evening. Have a nice night.